Marcus Reeves smelled like industrial bleach and burnt coffee. It was a permanent scent baked into the fibers of his gray work shirt, right beneath the embroidered patch that read Titan Aerodynamics Facilities Management. He tightened the bolt on the overhead HVAC unit, his knuckles white, the muscles in his forearm corded with tension. Below him, the pristine glass-walled R&D laboratory was falling apart. Not structurally. The building was a 50-story monument to modern architecture in downtown Atlanta, but the people inside were melting down. Marcus adjusted his position on the ladder, letting the cool air from the duct hit his sweating neck. He had been working for 12 hours. His lower back was a tight knot of agony, a souvenir from sleeping in the vinyl chair next to his daughter's hospital bed for the last 3 nights. Renata needed a ventricular septal defect repair, a hole in her heart. The union health insurance from his maintenance job covered a lot, but not the specialized pediatric thoracic surgeon who had a 6-month waiting list unless you had $50,000 in cash. Marcus had exactly $412 in his checking account. Down on the floor, the shouting escalated. I don't want to hear about thermal thresholds, Okafor. I want to know why a $70 million propulsion prototype is vibrating itself to dust on a test stand. That was Naomi Carver, 32, heir to the Carver Empire and currently its ruthless CEO. She paced the floor of the lab like a caged leopard. She wore a charcoal pantsuit that cost more than Marcus's truck, and her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, unforgiving knot. She didn't manage with soft skills. She managed with a scalpel, cutting away dead weight. Okafor, the lead engineer, ran a trembling hand over his balding head. Ms. Carver, the X7 core is pulling too much fuel. The manifold can't handle the pressure. The microfractures in the casing are a symptom, not the disease. The disease is incompetence, Naomi snapped, cutting him off. She stopped pacing and stared at the massive conical machine sitting in the center of the testing chamber. It was scorched black on one side. The launch window for the Department of Defense contract is in 3 days. If we don't have a stable burn test by tomorrow morning, they pull the funding. If they pull the funding, stock drops 20%. If the stock drops, half of you won't need to worry about the commute on Monday. The room of 6 highly paid engineers fell dead silent. They stared at their tablets, at their shoes, anywhere but the woman standing in the center of the room. Marcus watched from above. He knew what the problem was. He had known for 45 minutes. Before the hospital bills, before the bankruptcy, before the patent lawsuit that drained his life savings and left him blacklisted from the major engineering firms, Marcus had built things. He had designed fluid dynamic systems for deep-sea submersibles. He knew pressure. He knew flow. And listening to the X7 prototype spool up and choke for the last 2 hours, he knew exactly why it was failing. It was a harmonic resonance issue. The fuel injectors were vibrating at the exact same frequency as the casing's natural resonance. They weren't cracking from pressure. They were cracking from sound. Marcus reached for his rag, wiped the grease from his hands, and carefully closed the HVAC grate. The metallic clack of the latch echoed through the silent, tense laboratory. 7 heads snapped up to look at him. Marcus slowly descended the A-frame ladder. He didn't rush. He felt the weight of their stares. The wealthy CEO and her panicked geniuses looking at the guy with a mop bucket as if he were an insect that had just landed on their dining table. "Are you finished up there?" Naomi asked. Her voice wasn't cruel, just entirely devoid of interest. To her, Marcus was infrastructure. He was the plumbing. "Yeah," Marcus said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He picked up his toolbox. He should walk away. He should clock out, go to the hospital, and read Renata another chapter of a paperback she loved. But $50,000. He stopped at the edge of the testing chamber, looking through the blast glass at the ruined thruster core. "It's not your manifold," he said. The silence in the room thickened. Okafor let out a sharp, derisive scoff. "Excuse me? Are you lost, buddy? The service elevator is down the hall." Marcus ignored him. He kept his eyes on the machine. "You've got a harmonic feedback loop. Your fuel pump runs at 300 hertz. Your casing is an aluminum titanium alloy. It rings like a bell at 300 hertz. You're shaking the metal apart from the inside out. You could put a foot of solid steel around it, and it would still microfracture. Okafor turned red. "Ms. Carver, I'll call security." "Quiet, Okafor," Naomi said. She turned slowly, her heels clicking against the polished concrete floor until she was standing 3 feet from Marcus. She was tall, but he still had a few inches on her. She looked at him closely, really looked at him. She took in the grease under his fingernails, the exhaustion bruising his eyes, the cheap scuffed work boots. And how would a maintenance man know the resonant frequency of an experimental titanium alloy? She asked, her tone dangerously quiet. "I read the spec sheet on Okafor's desk while I was emptying his trash yesterday." Marcus lied smoothly. He actually knew it from a failed deep-sea drone project 5 years ago. Naomi stared at him. She looked back at the machine, then at her team of engineers, who were currently exchanging panicked, humiliated glances. She let out a harsh, bitter laugh. The stress of the last 72 hours seemed to suddenly peak, pushing her into a strange, reckless cynicism. "Right," Naomi said, throwing her hands up in mock surrender. "Perfect. My lead engineers are stumped, and the janitor has it all figured out." She looked at Marcus, a dark, sarcastic smile playing on her lips. "Tell you what, you fix the X7 by tomorrow morning, and I'm yours. Have my office. Have my car. Hell, you can have my job." The engineers chuckled nervously. It was a joke. A cruel, stress-induced dismissal meant to humiliate her team by comparing them to a blue-collar worker. Marcus didn't smile. He set his toolbox down on the floor with a heavy, deliberate thud. "I don't want her job," Marcus said. His voice carried across the room, steady and unyielding. "I want $50,000. Direct deposit, cleared by tomorrow noon." Naomi's mocking smile vanished. Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Marcus said, taking a step forward, closing the distance between them. The sterile smell of the lab suddenly met the scent of expensive sandalwood perfume. "I fixed this disaster by 8 a.m., and you pay for my daughter's heart surgery." Full stop. The air in the room was so thin you could choke on it. Okafor finally found his voice. "Ms. Carver, this is absurd. The man is a mechanic. He unclogs toilets. You're not actually going to let him touch a $70 million. Shut up, Okafor," Naomi said. Her eyes never left Marcus. She was analyzing him. Naomi Carver hadn't become CEO at 30 by making impulsive emotional decisions. She survived the boardroom by reading people. She looked at the man in front of her. He wasn't posturing. There was no arrogance in his posture, only a heavy, desperate gravity. The kind of desperation that only comes from a parent backed into a corner. $50,000, she repeated softly. "It's a fraction of what you'll lose if the DoD pulls out tomorrow," Marcus stated, perfectly logical. "You have no backup plan. They've been testing theories for 3 days. You got 12 hours left. What do you have to lose?" Naomi tilted her head. "If you fail, you're fired. No severance, no union protection. I'll make sure you never mop a floor in Atlanta again. If I fail, my daughter doesn't get her surgery and nothing else matters anyway," Marcus said flatly. "Deal." Naomi walked over to a nearby workstation, grabbed a heavy black marker, and pulled a piece of Titan Aerodynamics letterhead from tray. She scrawled 3 lines across the paper in sharp, aggressive handwriting. She signed the bottom and shoved it against Marcus's chest. Asterisk if Marcus Reeves stabilizes the X7 thruster core by 800 hours tomorrow, Titan Aerodynamics will pay a bonus of $50,000 immediately. If he fails, his employment is terminated with cause. Asterisk Marcus took a cheap ballpoint pen from his shirt pocket, clicked it, and signed his name next to hers. "Get out," Naomi said to the room at large. Okafor sputtered. "Ms. Carver, the security protocols, I said get out," she barked, the sudden volume making 2 of the junior engineers flinch. "All of you go home. You're useless to me right now." Within 60 seconds, the lab was empty, save for Naomi and Marcus. The heavy electronic doors sealed shut behind the retreating engineers with a soft hiss. Marcus didn't waste a single second looking at Naomi. He walked straight to the test chamber, punched the manual override code into the keypad, which he also wasn't supposed to know, and pushed the blast doors open. The smell of scorched metal and ozone hit him instantly. He walked around the massive thruster, running a calloused hand over the cooling fins. It was a beautiful piece of machinery ruined by a fundamental misunderstanding of physics. "So," Naomi said, leaning against the blast door frame, her arms crossed, "how exactly does a maintenance man fix a harmonic loop? You're going to hit it with a wrench." "No," Marcus said, sliding under the thruster chassis. He pulled a heavy wrench from his belt. "I'm going to decouple the fuel injection manifold and insert a dampening barrier. Then I'm going to rewrite the software timing so the pumps fire out of phase with the casing's resonance." Naomi stood in silence for a long moment. "Who are you exactly right now?" "I'm the guy saving your company," Marcus grunted, straining as he cracked a massive hex bolt loose. "Pass me that half-inch socket." She hesitated. The CEO of a billion-dollar tech empire being ordered to hand a tool to the janitor. But she walked over to his toolbox, found the socket, and handed it down to him. For the next 4 hours, they didn't speak. Marcus worked with a brutal, methodical efficiency. He stripped down the outer casing of the X7, his hands moving with the muscle memory of a man who had spent a lifetime tearing machines apart and putting them back together. He cut his knuckles twice, wiped the blood on his pants, and kept going. He pulled high-density silicone dampeners from a scrap bin in the corner of the lab, material Okafor had discarded as inferior, and began meticulously cutting them to fit the mounting brackets of the fuel pumps. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the kind of solution you put in a glossy brochure. It was a dirty, practical fix meant to break the physical connection between the vibration source and the metal. Naomi didn't leave. She retreated to one of the glass-walled offices overlooking the lab, watching him. She had a mountain of emails to answer, board members to placate, PR disasters to mitigate if the morning launch failed. But her eyes kept drifting down to the man in the gray shirt. At 2 a.m., the heavy fatigue set in. Marcus crawled out from under the machine, his arms shaking slightly. He sat on the floor, leaning back against a concrete pillar, and closed his eyes. Just for a minute. His chest ached. Renata's face flashed behind his eyelids, her pale skin, the faint blue tint to her lips when she laughed too hard. He heard the soft click of heels. He opened his eyes to see Naomi standing over him. She was holding 2 steaming paper cups. She held one out. "Black," she said. "I'm assuming you don't do oat milk lattes." "Thanks," Marcus muttered, taking the cup. His fingers brushed hers. Hers were cold. His were burning hot and coated in grease. Naomi sat down on the floor next to him. She didn't seem to care about the dust getting on her suit. She stared at the disassembled machine. "I'll look you up," she said quietly. Marcus took a sip of the scalding, bitter coffee. "I figured you would." Marcus Reeves, lead propulsion designer at Voss Dynamics, left abruptly 4 years ago, sued by Voss for intellectual property theft regarding a variable flow valve patent. "You lost." Declared bankruptcy a year later. "They had better lawyers," Marcus said, staring straight ahead. "They buried me in injunctions until I couldn't afford to feed my kid. Then they took the patent. Why maintenance? Because it paid hourly. It didn't require me to sign a non-compete, and it had the best union health care in the state of Georgia," Marcus said. He turned his head to look at her. "I didn't care about rockets anymore. I just cared about keeping my daughter breathing." Naomi looked down at her coffee cup. The harsh fluorescent lights caught the sharp angles of her face. For the first time all night, she looked tired. The armor of the arrogant CEO slipped just a fraction. "My father built this company," she said, her voice dropping a register. "He was an engineer. Built the first Carver engine in our garage. He used to smell like that." She nodded toward Marcus's hands. "Like solvent and steel. When he died, the board tried to push me out. Said I was just a suit. Said I didn't understand the metal." She looked back at the X7. "If this fails tomorrow, they'll vote me out by Friday. They'll carve up the company and sell it to Voss." Marcus felt a strange shift in his chest. He had spent the last 3 years despising the wealthy elites who walked the halls above him, seeing them as part of the machine that crushed people like him. But sitting here on the dirty concrete, smelling the coffee and the ozone, Naomi Carver just seemed like someone else fighting a battle they couldn't afford to lose. The dampeners are in, Marcus said, breaking the quiet. He pushed himself up off the floor, his joints popping. Now I need to rewrite the injection sequence. I need your login credentials. Okafor locked the terminal. Naomi stood up, brushing off her pants. She walked over to the main console, typed in her master password, and stepped back. It's all yours, Reeves, she said softly. The glow of the dual monitors cast harsh blue shadows across Marcus's face as his fingers flew over the mechanical keyboard. It had been years since he had written raw code for a propulsion sequence. At first, he was rusty, backspacing and correcting syntax errors. But slowly, the old rhythm returned. It was like riding a bicycle. If the bicycle was a bomb designed to throw fire out of titanium nozzle, he was rewriting the firing timing, staggering the fuel injection pulses by milliseconds. It was a chaotic rhythm, entirely counterintuitive to the smooth, simultaneous burns the manual recommended, but it would break the harmonic resonance. Naomi stood behind his chair, leaning over slightly to watch the code scroll across the screen. He could feel the warmth radiating from her, catch the subtle scent of sandalwood cutting through the stale air. You're offsetting the primary and secondary pumps, she noted, tracing a line of code on the screen with a manicured fingernail. Won't that create an asymmetrical thrust pattern? Only in the first stage of ignition, Marcus explained, not looking away from the screen. Once the chamber pressure reaches nominal levels, the thermal expansion of the casing alters its natural frequency. At that point, the code phases them back into sync. You just have to survive the first 30 seconds of spool-up. Naomi was silent. Marcus finally glanced back at her. She was staring at the code, her eyes tracking the logic loops. Then she looked down at him. There was no arrogance left in her expression, only an intense, burning curiosity. You're doing in 4 hours what a team of MIT graduates couldn't do in 3 months, she murmured. They rely on simulations, Marcus said, turning back to the screen and hitting execute to compile the new script. Simulations assume perfect materials, perfect conditions. Metal isn't perfect. It has flaws. You have to work with the flaws, not pretend they don't exist. He hit enter. The system accepted the override. Done, Marcus said, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. He checked his watch. It was 6:15 a.m. Through the high, narrow windows of a lab, the Atlanta sky was beginning to turn a bruised, pale purple. Are we ready for a hot fire? Naomi asked. Her voice was steady, but Marcus could hear the slight tremor of adrenaline beneath it. Yeah. Marcus stood up and grabbed a heavy pair of ear defenders from the wall rack, tossing them to her. He grabbed a second pair for himself. Clear the floor. Get behind the blast glass. They retreated into the fortified control booth overlooking the test chamber. Marcus took the operator's seat. He flipped the master arming switch. Red warning lights bathed the room in a rhythmic, pulsing glow. Fuel lines open, Marcus called out, running through the checklist from memory. Igniters armed. Give me the key. Naomi reached under her collar, pulled a physical brass key from a chain around her neck, and inserted it into the console. She turned it. Authorization accepted. The automated voice droned over the PA system. Marcus looked at Naomi. She was gripping the edge of the console, her knuckles white. She looked back at him, gave a short, sharp nod. Firing in 3, 2, 1. Marcus pushed the throttle lever forward. Through the 4-inch thick blast glass, the world turned into a silent, blinding sun. The X-7 thruster ignited. Even through the soundproofing and the ear defenders, the noise was a physical force vibrating deep inside Marcus's chest. He stared at the telemetry data on the screen. 10 seconds. The vibration sensors on the casing spiked, flashing yellow. 15 seconds. The numbers climbed. Marcus held his breath. This was the threshold. This was where Okafor's test had all violently ended. 20 seconds. The fuel pump stuttered perfectly, firing in the chaotic, syncopated rhythm Marcus had programmed. The vibration graph flatlined. The silicone dampeners absorbed the shock. The harmonic loop broke. 30 seconds. The casing temperature reached optimal heat. The metal expanded. On the screen, Marcus's code automatically shifted the pumps back into symmetrical firing. The thruster smoothed out, settling into a continuous, deafening, beautiful roar of sustained power. The thrust output climbed past 100%, holding steady at 104%. "It's holding," Marcus said, his voice loud over the ambient rumble. "Chamber pressure is nominal. Vibration is minimal. It's stable." Naomi let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for 3 days. She ripped her ear defenders off, staring through the glass at the pillar of blue fire. She turned to Marcus. Her eyes were wide, shining in the harsh light of the monitors. She didn't say a word. She just looked at him, realizing exactly what he had done. He hadn't just fixed a machine. He had secured the DoD contract. He had saved her board seat. He had saved Titan Aerodynamics. Marcus reached over and pulled the throttle back. The fire died abruptly, leaving the test chamber filled with smoke and the metallic ticking of cooling metal. The heavy silence returned to the lab, louder than the explosion. At exactly 7:30 a.m., the electronic doors to the lab hissed open. Okafor walked in holding a briefcase, looking like a man walking to his execution. 2 other engineers trailed behind him. They stopped dead in their tracks. The X-7 was still sitting on the stand. It wasn't in pieces. It was smoking gently. The titanium casing glowed a dull cherry red in places. The unmistakable smell of a successful full-duration burn hung in the air. Okafor dropped his briefcase. It hit the floor with a loud smack. Naomi walked out of the control booth, buttoning the jacket of her suit. She looked perfectly composed, terrifyingly in control. Marcus followed a few paces behind, quietly packing his tools back into his battered red box. "Ms. Carver," Okafor stammered, staring at the telemetry screens visible through the booth window. The output data, it held. It held at 104% efficiency for a full minute. It turns out the issue was a harmonic resonance loop, fixed with $20 worth of silicone and a rewrite of the injection phasing, Naomi said, her voice dripping with ice. Okafor turned pale, looking from the machine to Marcus, who was hoisting his toolbox onto his shoulder. He actually touched the prototype. "Ms. Carver, that violates every protocol." "The only protocol I care about is success." "Okafor," Naomi interrupted. "The DoD gets their data packet in an hour. Be ready for the briefing." She turned away from her stunned engineering team and walked over to Marcus. He was standing near the service elevator, waiting to go back down to the basement, back to the mop buckets and the fluorescent hum. Naomi stopped in front of him. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen a few times. Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. A notification from his banking app. "Incoming wire transfer, Titan Aerodynamics. Amount $50,000. Status, cleared." Marcus stared at the screen. The heavy, suffocating weight that had been sitting on his chest for 6 months suddenly vanished. He could breathe. Renato was going to be okay. He closed his eyes for a second, swallowing hard against the sudden tightness in his throat. When he opened them, Naomi was watching him, her expression unreadable. "A deal is a deal," she said softly, so the engineers couldn't hear. "Thank you," Marcus said. It wasn't enough, but it was all he had. He turned to press the elevator button. "Wait," Naomi said. Marcus paused, looking back over his shoulder. Naomi took a step closer. The dynamic between them had shifted drastically in the last 8 hours. He wasn't the invisible maintenance man anymore, and she wasn't just the ruthless executive. The memory of the sarcastic bet she had thrown at him the day before suddenly hung heavy in the air between them. "I told you yesterday," Naomi said, her voice dropping to a low, intense murmur, "that if you fix this, you could have whatever you wanted." She looked at his grease-stained shirt, then up into his tired, heavy eyes. "I don't make jokes, Reeves. I don't go back on my word. So what do you want?" Marcus looked at the beautiful, intimidating billionaire standing in front of him. He thought about the basement. He thought about Voss Dynamics. He thought about the fire he had just built with his own 2 hands. "I need a shower," Marcus said quietly. "And then I need to go see my daughter." He stepped into the elevator as the doors opened. "But if you're serious," he added, the doors beginning to close, "I'll take your job." The door shut, leaving Naomi Carver standing alone in the R&D lab, staring at the elevator, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. The pediatric cardiology wing at Piedmont Regional smelled like aggressive cherry disinfectant and old fear. It was a smell Marcus knew intimately. He sat in the cracked vinyl chair beside Renata's bed. She was asleep. The rhythmic beep of her heart monitored the only sound in the dim room. She looked so small, wrapped in the heavy white hospital blankets, her dark curls fanned out across the thin pillow. Dr. Elias Whitfield walked in holding a tablet. Whitfield was the best pediatric thoracic surgeon on the East Coast, a man whose time was measured in thousands of dollars per hour. He looked at Marcus with a mixture of professional detachment and mild surprise. "Mr. Reeves, billing just notified me that a $50,000 wire transfer cleared your account an hour ago." He tapped his screen. "I assumed there was an error." "No error," Marcus said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. He didn't elaborate. "When do we cut?" Whitfield set the tablet down. "I have an opening in the surgical theater tomorrow at 6 a.m. We'll prep her at 4. The defect is localized. We go in, patch the septum, and she'll be recovering by noon." Marcus let out a slow, shaking breath. He looked at his daughter, the crushing weight that had sat on his chest for 6 months finally fracturing. "Thank you, document. Don't thank me yet. Get some sleep, Mr. Reeves. Tomorrow is a long day." While Marcus watched his daughter sleep 3 miles away, Naomi Carver was executing a bloodbath. The Titan Aerodynamics boardroom was a sprawling expanse of glass and cold steel overlooking the Chattahoochee River. 7 board members sat around the mahogany table, reviewing the DoD contract confirmation that had arrived 20 minutes prior. The atmosphere was a bizarre mix of relief and defensive posturing. "The DoD is satisfied," Delacroix, the board chairman, said, adjusting his tie. "The X-7 launch is greenlit for Q3. You pulled it off, Naomi." "Barely." "There was no barely about it," Naomi replied. She sat at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her expression lethal. "The prototype hit 104% efficiency. We didn't just meet the DoD's metrics. We shattered them." "Yes." "Well, Okafor's team really stepped up at the 11th hour," Delacroix noted, scanning the summary report. "Okafor is fired," Naomi stated flatly. The room went dead silent. Delacroix lowered the paper. "Excuse me? You can't fire the head of propulsion after a successful test." "I can, and I did 10 minutes ago." Naomi stood up, pacing slowly down the length of the table. "Okafor didn't fix the X-7. Okafor nearly destroyed it. And this company, because he was too arrogant to admit his thermal models were flawed. The test was salvaged by a man from facilities management. A maintenance worker." The board members exchanged bewildered glances. "Naomi, this isn't a time for your eccentric power plays," Delacroix warned, his voice dropping an octave. "We need stability. We need competence," Naomi shot back, stopping behind Delacroix's chair. She slapped a thick-bound dossier onto the table. It slid to the center. "That is the background file on Marcus Reeves. Until 4 years ago, he was Voss Dynamics' lead designer. Voss stole his variable flow valve patent through a rigged litigation process, bankrupted him, and blacklisted him from the industry." She leaned forward, planting her hands on the polished wood. "The man who just fixed our $70 million engine with scrap silicone and a keyboard is scrubbing our toilets while Voss is using his stolen tech to bid against us for the upcoming NASA payload contract." Delacroix frowned, flipping the dossier open. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you," Naomi said, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet register. "I am creating a new division. Advanced Experimental Systems. Marcus Reeves is going to run it. And then we're going to use Titan's legal department to countersue Voss Dynamics, invalidate their patent, and gut them in the federal courts." Delacroix sighed, rubbing his temples. "You can't just hand an executive engineering role to a janitor because he got lucky once, Naomi. The optics, if you fight me on this, Delacroix, I will take the DoD telemetry data to the press and tell them exactly who fixed it while your hand-picked MIT geniuses hid in the hallway," Naomi said softly. "I will publicly humiliate this board. Do not test me today." She held his gaze until Delacroix looked away, clearing his throat. Fina, draw up the paperwork. Naomi grabbed her coat from the back of her chair. I already did. The hospital cafeteria at 2 a.m. was a purgatory of flickering fluorescent lights and stale vending machine coffee. Marcus sat at a small laminate table, staring blindly at a styrofoam cup. Renata's surgery was in 2 hours. He was running on adrenaline and caffeine, his mind cycling endlessly through surgical risks and recovery statistics. The soft click of heels pulled him out of the spiral. Naomi Carver walked into the sterile cafeteria. She had traded her charcoal suit for a tailored black trench coat, but she still looked entirely out of place. A shark swimming in a municipal pool. She carried a thick manila folder under one arm and a sleek thermos in the other. She didn't ask for permission. She sat down across from him and pushed the thermos across the table. Guatemalan dark roast, Naomi said. It beats whatever battery acid you bought from that machine. Marcus looked at the thermos, then up at her. You didn't have to come here. The deal is done. The money is in the account. How is she? Naomi asked, ignoring his statement. Prepping for surgery at 4. They say she'll be fine. Marcus rubbed his jaw, the heavy stubble scraping against his palm. Why are you here, Naomi? It was the first time he had used her first name. It shifted the air between them, stripping away the titles of CEO and maintenance man. Naomi opened the manila folder and slid a thick stack of legal documents across the table. You told me you wanted my job. I can't give you that. The board would stage a coup, and honestly, you'd hate the meetings. She looked down at the documents. The bold heading on the top page read, Employment Contract, Director of Advanced Experimental Systems. I fired Okafor. Naomi continued casually, taking a sip from her own cup. He lacked vision. You have vision. You understand the metal. I want to build in my engines, Marcus. Blank check on R&D. You report only to me. Marcus stared at the contract. The salary listed was an absurd number. It was enough to buy a house, to set up a college fund for Renata, to never worry about a hospital bill again. But his jaw tightened. I told you yesterday, Marcus said quietly. I don't care about rockets anymore. Boss took that from me. They took my work, twisted it, and used it to crush me. I'm not putting myself back in that crosshair. I just want a quiet life for my kid. Naomi didn't flinch. She reached into the folder and pulled out a second stack of paper. She slid it on top of the employment contract. This one was a legal brief. Asterisk Titan Aerodynamics versus Voss Dynamics. Civil action. Intellectual property theft and corporate malfeasance. Asterisk Marcus's breath hitched. He read the plaintiff line. Titan Aerodynamics was putting its entire corporate weight, its billion-dollar legal team, behind his stolen patent. I did some digging into Richard Voss and the Voss board, Naomi said, her voice practically purring with predatory anticipation. They didn't just outlaw you. They bribed a patent clerk to backdate their filing. My private investigators found the paper trail this afternoon. Marcus looked up at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't the erratic, fearful beat he had felt in the hospital room. It was the heavy, violent pulse of a dormant engine roaring back to life. You're going after Voss, Marcus whispered. No, Naomi corrected softly, leaning across the small table, her dark eyes locked onto his, burning with a fierce, uncompromising intelligence. We are going after Voss. I want the NASA contract they're bidding on. You want her life's work back. We tear them down to the studs together. Marcus looked at the woman sitting across from him. She wasn't offering charity. She was offering a war, and she was handing him a loaded weapon. He remembered the bed in the lab. Fix it, and I'm yours. He had thought it was a sarcastic deflection. He realized now it was an evaluation. She had been waiting to see if he was a mechanic or a peer. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the cheap ballpoint pen he had used the day before. He clicked it. He signed the employment contract. Then he signed the legal authorization. He slid the papers back across the table. Naomi smiled. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing. She packed the documents back into the folder. Go sit with your daughter, Marcus, she said, standing up and smoothing her coat. Take the month off, fully paid. When she's recovered, I expect you in your new office on the 50th floor. She turned to walk away. Naomi, Marcus called out. She paused, looking back over her shoulder. "Thanks for the coffee," he said, a genuine, hard-earned smirk finally breaking through his exhaustion. Naomi's smile softened just a fraction. "See you at work, Reeves." As she walked out of the cafeteria, the hospital didn't smell quite so much like fear anymore. It smelled like dark roast coffee, ozone, and a burning, brilliant future. Renata's surgery went exactly as Dr. Whitfield promised. For hours under the lights, a hairline incision no bigger than Marcus's thumb, and by noon the next day, she was breathing on her own, color returning to her lips for the first time in months. Marcus sat by her bed for 3 straight days, watching the monitor tick out its steady rhythm, memorizing the sound of it the way other men memorize scripture. On the 4th day, when Renata was well enough to sit up and eat solid food, she looked at her father with a frank, unfiltered curiosity only an 8-year-old could manage. "Daddy, why do you keep checking your phone?" Marcus set the phone face down on the bed tray. "Just work stuff, baby. You don't work at the hospital." "No, I used to work someplace that made rockets. I might go back to that." Renata considered this with the gravity of a much older person. "Will you still pick me up from school?" "Every single day," Marcus said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. 2 weeks later, on a gray, drizzling Monday, Marcus Reeves walked into the lobby of Titan Aerodynamics wearing a suit that still felt like a costume. The gray work shirt was folded in a drawer at home. He hadn't been able to throw it away. The receptionist, a young woman named Odalise who had definitely seen him mopping this same floor a month earlier, did a visible double-take before recovering her professional composure. "Mr. Reeves, Ms. Carver is expecting you." 50th floor. The elevator ride felt longer than it had any right to be. When the doors opened, Marcus stepped out into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the whole sprawl of the city, the river a silver ribbon in the distance. Naomi was standing at the window, her back to him, a tablet in one hand. "You're 3 minutes late," she said without turning around. "Traffic on the 75, Marcus said. "You could build me a rocket car." Naomi turned, and for just a second, the ice in her expression cracked into something almost like delight. "I'm working on it." She set the tablet down on her desk and gestured to a chair. "See, we have a division to build and a lawsuit to win, and I don't have patience for slow starts." Marcus sat. On the desk between them was a folder marked Advanced Experimental Systems, Staffing and Budget. Beside it, a second folder, VOS Dynamics, Discovery Phase 1. "Where do we start?" Marcus asked. "With the truth," Naomi said, sliding the second folder toward him. "VOS has been telling the industry for 4 years that you stole ideas from them. We're going to make sure every engineer, every investor, and every federal judge in this country knows exactly whose ideas those were to begin with." Marcus opened the folder. Inside were his own schematics. The real ones, the originals, recovered from an old backup server his lawyer had subpoenaed years too late to matter. Seeing his own handwriting on the margins, the notes he'd made it to in the morning with Renata asleep in the next room, hit him harder than he expected. "I thought these were gone," he said quietly. "Nothing's ever really gone," Naomi said. "You just have to know where to dig. And I have very good diggers." Over the following months, the story of Titan Aerodynamics' new Advanced Experimental Systems division began to leak in careful, deliberate pieces into trade publications. A maintenance worker turned director. A CEO who staked her company's flagship contract on a hunch. The X-7 thruster, redesigned around Marcus's dampening principle, went on to post the highest efficiency ratings of any propulsion system in its class. The Department of Defense renewed the contract for another 3 years. Titan stock, which had been on the verge of a 20% collapse, climbed instead to an all-time high. VOS Dynamics, meanwhile, found itself on the wrong end of a countersuit backed by Titan's legal department and a forensic paper trail connecting a mid-level patent clerk to an offshore account. The case never made it to trial. VOS settled quietly, reassigning the disputed patent back to Marcus and paying a confidential sum that, combined with his new salary, meant Marcus would never again have to check his banking app with his heart in his throat. Richard VOS resigned within the year. Marcus felt no particular satisfaction in it, only a kind of settling, like a bone that had been broken and reset, finally knitting straight. Naomi kept her promise about the office. She kept her promise about the money. What she hadn't promised, and what neither of them had expected, was the quiet, stubborn thing that grew between them over the long nights in the lab, the shared coffee at odd hours, the way she started showing up at the test stand, not because she had to, but because she wanted to watch him work. 8 months after the night the X-7 first held steady at 104%, Marcus stood on the observation deck outside her office, watching the sun set orange and gold over the Atlanta skyline. Naomi came to stand beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his. "You ever think about how it started?" she asked. "Me making a bet I thought was a joke." "Every day," Marcus admitted. "I think about the shirt. That gray one. I still have it." "Burn it," Naomi said, but there was no bite in it. "Can't. It's got history in it." He glanced sideways at her. "So does the woman who bet her whole company on a hunch about a janitor." Naomi laughed, a real laugh, rare and unguarded. "I didn't bet on a hunch, Reeves. I bet on the only person in that room who wasn't afraid to tell me the truth." She turned to face him fully. "That's rarer than good engineering." "Renata asked about you last week," Marcus said. "Wanted to know if the rocket lady was going to come to her birthday party." Naomi's carefully composed expression softened into something unguarded and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, unafraid. "Tell her I wouldn't miss it." Below them, the city lights began to flicker on one by one. And somewhere deep in the building, in a lab that no longer smelled like fear, a new prototype hummed quietly on its stand, waiting for its own turn to prove that the things everyone had written off as broken were sometimes just waiting for the right person to look a little closer. Marcus Reeves had walked into that building 4 years ago, blacklisted, broke, and invisible. He walked out of it now, most evenings, with his daughter's laughter waiting for him at home, and a woman beside him who had never once needed him to be anything other than exactly what he was, a man who understood metal, who understood pressure, who understood that everything with a flaw could still be fixed if you were willing to get your hands dirty enough to find it. Some deals are written in ink. Some are written in fire, in grease, and sleepless nights, and the particular kind of trust that only gets built when two people refuse to look away from each other's worst moments. Marcus and Naomi's had started as a cruel joke thrown across a smoking test chamber. It ended as something neither the board, nor Voss Dynamics, nor even Naomi herself had ever quite planned for. A partnership that remade a company, restored a stolen legacy, and gave a tired, desperate father back his life, one bolt at a time. And on the 50th floor of a building that once saw him only as the plumbing, Marcus Reeves finally, fully belonged. The Advanced Experimental Systems Division didn't stay small for long. Within a year, Marcus had hired 11 engineers, and he was ruthless about exactly one qualification. Nobody got in the door on a pedigree alone. He'd pulled 2 of his best people, Danica Osei and a stubborn kid named Corwin Blake, straight out of community college robotics programs that the old Titan hiring committee wouldn't have looked at twice. Naomi never once questioned his staffing choices. She'd learned, in that first brutal night in the lab, that Marcus Reeves's judgment about who understood metal and who was faking it was worth more than any diploma the board could wave at her. "You're building an island of misfits," Delacroix said to her once, not unkindly, watching through the glass as Danica argued animatedly with Corwin over a whiteboard covered in fluid dynamics equations. "I'm building the only division in this company that's never lied to me about a deadline," Naomi replied. "I'll take misfits who tell the truth over geniuses who cover for each other every time." The Voss settlement money didn't sit idle. Marcus put 1/3 of it into a scholarship fund at his old community college, seated quietly, without his name attached, for kids who wanted to study propulsion engineering but couldn't afford the tuition at the schools that handed out the internships. When a reporter from a trade magazine eventually traced the fund back to him and asked why he'd kept it anonymous, Marcus just shrugged. "Nobody helped me put my name on anything when I needed the help," he said. "Wasn't about to start needing credit now that I don't." Richard Voss's fall from grace, once it started, went faster than anyone at Titan had predicted. The forensic trail through the patent office didn't just implicate the one clerk. It pulled in two members of Voss's own legal team, both of whom flipped rather than face obstruction charges, and by the time the story broke fully in the press, three other companies that had quietly licensed disputed Voss patents over the years came forward with their own claims. What had started as one countersuit over a single stolen valve design became, within 18 months, a full unraveling of Voss Dynamics' patent portfolio. The NASA payload contract that Naomi had wanted so badly went to Titan Aerodynamics uncontested. Voss withdrew its bid rather than risk further scrutiny during an active federal investigation. Marcus felt the strangest thing when he read the final court filing confirming his name back on the original variable flow valve patent. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter, like a held breath finally let out after 4 years. He drove straight from the courthouse to Renata's school, arriving 20 minutes before pickup, and sat in his truck in the parking lot until the bell rang, just so he could be the first face she saw walking out the door. "You're crying," Renata said, climbing into the passenger's seat, more curious than concerned. "Happy crying," Marcus said. "Grown-ups do that sometimes when something that was broken for a long time finally gets fixed. Like the rocket. Bigger than the rocket, baby. Buckle up." Naomi threw a party for the division on the rooftop terrace the week the settlement was finalized, insisting on catering from the same barbecue place 2 blocks from the old facilities office where Marcus used to eat his lunch alone. Half the executive floor showed up in suits. Half of Marcus's team showed up in whatever they'd been wearing in the lab that afternoon, and nobody seemed to notice or care about the difference. Naomi stood at the edge of the party for a long while, a glass of wine untouched in her hand, just watching the two worlds blend into one without any of the friction she'd have predicted a year earlier. "You did this," Marcus said, coming to stand beside her. "I signed some paperwork," Naomi said. "You're the one who convinced 11 engineers that a division built by a former janitor was worth betting their careers on. Takes 2 people willing to bet on something nobody else would touch," Marcus said. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, the city lights catching gold in her dark eyes. "Is that what we're calling it? A bet?" "For now," Marcus said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Ask me again in a year." She did, almost exactly a year later, on the same rooftop under the same sky, and by then the answer had changed into something neither of them needed to say out loud, because it was already written into every late night in the lab, every cup of bitter coffee passed between cold and grease-stained hands, every quiet promise kept when nobody was around to make either of them keep it. Some fixes hold because of dampeners and phased injection timing. Some hold because 2 people decided, one impossible night, to stop treating each other like the roles they've been assigned and start seeing each other as exactly who they were. Titan Aerodynamics got its contract. Marcus Reeves got his name back, his daughter's health, and a life he'd stopped believing he was allowed to want. And on the 50th floor of a building that once saw him only as the plumbing, in an office with a view of a river he used to drive past on his way to the hospital and back, Marcus Reeves finally, fully, and for good belonged.